From British Prime Minister to champion of children's education, Gordon Brown launches a global fund for learning. But will it get the support it needs to help millions of children displaced by war and disaster? Also on today's program, you may have heard the acronym, but what does the OSCE do? 4 decades after it was formed, we ask if Europe's security organization is facing an identity crisis. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. He was a powerful politician responsible for Britain's finances for a decade before his dogged determination got him the job he always wanted, that of UK Prime Minister in 2007. Now Gordon Brown has a new role and a new cause, promoting children's education at the UN. This week here in Istanbul, he launched a crisis fund to help the millions of children missing out on school because of war and natural disasters. He says without education, children risk becoming the youngest laborers, the youngest brides at the altar, and the youngest recruits of extremism. Our newsmaker today is the UN's Special Envoy, Gordon Brown.
He was once a leader in waiting, standing patiently behind a man who won 3 general elections in Britain. But when his moment came in 2007, Gordon Brown as Prime Minister didn't have the PR panache of Tony Blair.
A good family. Good to see you.
His abilities were doubted when in office. No more so than when a rogue microphone picked up his real thoughts about a voter.
I should never have put me with that woman. Whose idea was that? She's just a sort of bigoted woman.
The result was the Labour Party's biggest loss of seats in a UK general election since 1931. Gordon Brown left the political scene quietly, retreating to write books. But he found a roaring voice when Scotland voted on independence from Britain.
What kind of message does Scotland send to the world if tomorrow we said we're going to give up on sharing?
Sharing a political fervour that was often absent from his days as British Prime Minister. He now focuses on projects involving education and global finance. His latest being a new drive to fund education during emergencies. It's estimated that less than 2% of humanitarian aid currently goes to the funding of education. That 80 million children have had their education disrupted by crises. He says he wants to reach and help more than 13.6 million children over the next 5 years. As a humanitarian campaigner, this once embattled politician appears to have found his true voice. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
I spoke to Gordon Brown at the World Humanitarian Summit here in Istanbul. I began by asking him why his new crisis fund is necessary and if it will work.
It's the first humanitarian fund for education in emergencies. Education of school children falls completely through the net at the moment. Either the money is going in humanitarian aid to food and shelter, or it's going in development aid, which is long-term and can't deal with an emergency. And so there is a gap, and we've got to fill it, because there are 75 million children in the world whose education is being interrupted by conflict or by crises or by earthquake or emergencies. And there are many children who are prevented from going to college or university when they've got the qualifications, and children lose hope. If they cannot go to school, if they cannot plan for the future, if they cannot prepare for the world after school, then we have a desolate generation of young people who are being lost, and we've got to do something about it immediately.
Okay, let me ask you about your home country now, the United Kingdom. There's a big vote coming up. You're clear in your hopes that the UK will stay in Europe. Why should the UK stay in Europe?
Well, I could talk about Brexit and the dangers of it, and I could talk about the more positive arguments that I believe have got to be brought forward about jobs, about security, about dealing with tax havens, about making sure that we have a better environmental and energy policy. And these are the arguments that people should be looking at over the next few weeks. But I am here to talk about education in emergencies, and I want to continue to talk about what we can do on that. There will be other times to debate the future of Europe over the next few weeks, but today I'm here at this humanitarian summit when there is so much need in this region. I want to talk about that.
Okay, but to just one final question before we go back to education. You gave a stirring speech during the time of the Scottish referendum, just on the eve of the referendum. Will we expect you to come out again in all guns blazing in order to get people to stay?
Well, I'm speaking tomorrow in Brussels. I'm doing a lot of rallies and meetings around the United Kingdom over the next few weeks, but we are still there's still a month to go to this referendum. I think most people will start listening more intently to what is being said in the last few days. So at the moment my concentrations are on making sure this new fund for education in emergencies is created, making sure we have the donors around the world who are prepared to contribute. We've said that there are 100 different organizations around the world, businesses, philanthropists, foundations, as well as governments, that are in a position to contribute to this new education kind of weight fund. And over the next few weeks, I'll be approaching all of them and asking them to help.
What's been the most uplifting thing you've heard over the past 24 hours here?
I think it's the stories of young people themselves. You know, my children are at school and they're young, and if someone said you can have a day off school, they'd be quite happy. If someone said you could have a week off school, they'd probably be overjoyed. But young people who are denied schooling for months know the importance of it to them. And when you hear stories of children begging to go to school, saying, why can't I go to school? Saying, I want to learn for the future. I met a kid in Beirut, and I was asking him, as you do, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said, I want to be an engineer. And I said, why an engineer? Because it's not a terribly popular thing with some of the kids that I talk to. And he said, because I want to rebuild Syria. And it's moving stories like that, particularly of children who have been forced into some of the most impossible situations, some of them forced into child marriage, some of them trafficked, some of them working all hours of the day and never having the chance to get to school. And their pleas, as we've seen at this conference with global youth ambassadors brought here by the World at School, saying, we want to go to school.
Doctors Without Borders, MSF, said this conference was a fig leaf of good intentions. They weren't convinced that anything concrete was going to come out of this. What do you say to them? But
one thing that is concrete has already been announced today, and that is a fund for education in emergencies. The Business Coalition offered 100 million that they would raise for it. Countries have already started. We've opened the appeal, and I think in the last few hours we've got more than 100 million more. And people, when they see that this cause is an essential part of the humanitarian response to emergencies, are prepared to give. So I don't want to comment on what's happening in other areas, because this is the area that I've been deeply involved in, but the Turkish government have convened a conference here under the United Nations auspices that has already got this success, which is the first ever humanitarian fund for education in emergencies. And it's not only novel because it's an education fund, it's a public-private partnership, it's bridging humanitarian aid, which was about food and shelter, with development aid, which can now move into the field of education. And we're offering children who are out of school the chance that even if they're refugees for years on end and displaced from their country, we have an obligation to help them get the education they need. So it is an achievement already of this conference, but of course the challenge and the record of success will be whether we raise the money that's necessary.
Underpinning everything and this education gap and all the other gaps is the politics of it all, the root causes of conflict. And when you keep that in mind, it's great that you're here, former UK Prime Minister. It's great to see Angela Merkel here, the Secretary General here, President Erdogan's here. However, are you disappointed that Vladimir Putin's not here, Sergei Lavrov, President Obama, John Kerry? Are you disappointed that they didn't get involved?
Well, I think each country's made its own decision about how much it is going to do and announce at this conference. President Obama, for example, has called a special conference on refugees in September, so presumably his efforts and his funding announcements will come at that conference in September. So each country has a different view as to when it's going to do something. The question is whether together as an international community we're doing enough. And the answer is no, we are not doing enough. We have got to do more.
Root causes again, how do we solve Syria?
You know, if I was part of the negotiators, I would tell you that unless we can get some negotiated settlement, then every peace agreement will be fragile. So we need a settlement that is long-term, that is sustainable, that involves all the parties. And that is really something that I know John Kerry, but all the other negotiators are working towards. And I can't contribute any expertise because I'm not on the inside of these discussions. What I do know, however, is that whatever happens, the need to rebuild Syria is going to be obvious, that reconstruction in the region is going to be necessary, that the future of young people has been imperiled by the very fact of a civil war, and we've got to prepare for that future. And so side by side with the peace process, we need to be thinking of reconstruction, and we do need that Marshall Plan for the region, and I believe it extends to North Africa as well as to the Middle East.
You say it extends to North Africa. Everything seems to be inextricably intertwined in this globalized world. As a European, how do you feel about the fact that a far-right leader came one sliver away from being elected president in Austria?
You see, on the one hand, we've got globalization, which opens up the world and creates a need to cooperate. On the other hand, you can see the populist reaction, which is as people see a world economy or a world that looks like a runaway train and out of control, it awakens in them, or reawakens in some cases, a need to belong. And so side by side with the need to integrate the world economy because it's interconnected, you also see this demand to bring control back home. And you're seeing it all across Europe, you're seeing it even in America with the candidatures for the presidency. You see this popular and protectionist reaction to globalization. And so globalization needs a human face. We need to show that we can manage globalization in the well rather than badly. People feel power is everywhere where they're not at the moment, and they need to have a sense that we're going to manage it for the best interests of them and their families and their communities in the future. So what comes out of the protests, the isolationism in some cases, the anger against refugees in other places, the desire to close your borders in other places, protectionist attitudes on trade elsewhere, is we need to recognize that with the advantages we have from globalization and the opening up of markets and opportunities and the global sourcing of goods and services, which makes goods cheapest to people, we also have this desperate need that people feel that they bring events under control, and in some cases a demand that is unrealistic, of course, to bring control back home, because we've got to cooperate in an ever more independent world. So it's up to the world leaders to answer these questions by showing that we can manage globalization better.
And tying that back to the education fund, those voters for populist demagogues, if you like, whether it's Donald Trump or European nationalist politicians, will say, why are you spending billions of dollars on refugees in a far-off place, in conflicts that have nothing to do with us? We need to look after our own. Why, Gordon Brown? Why?
If Austrians look at it, then if they want to slow down the pressures of migration from the Middle East or from North Africa, then the best way they can do it is giving young people the opportunity to get an education in the country or in the region in which they live. So even if it was simply self-serving to slow down the waves of migration, there's a huge case for investing in education for young people to stay in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. But of course there is another reason, that young people who become frustrated and discontented become exploited by terrorist groups and can turn to extremism.
I know your schedule's very tight, so it would be remiss of me not to ask you about your beloved Labour Party, if you'll allow me, before you go.
I think I've answered questions on everything, but I'm really going to talk about education in emergencies
If
today.
you don't mind, as the final question.
You can ask me, but I'm not going to answer.
Are you worried about the future of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn? Accusations of anti-Semitism. Things are not well within the Labour Party. Are you worried?
Anti-Semitism has no place in any political party, in any community and in any country. And I think the election of Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London showed that the people of London and who voted Labour will not be divided on the issue of race, will not be divided on the issues of religion, will not allow sectarianism or prejudice or discrimination ever to dominate the thinking of people when they come to voting, but also the way they relate to other people. And the Jewish community have got a very strong and welcome presence in London and in the whole of the United Kingdom.
So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not since the end of the Cold War have tensions with Russia been so high in Europe. After the annexation of Crimea by pro-Russian rebels, daily aggression in eastern Ukraine threatens to further destabilize the region. Europe faces further security challenges from the influx of thousands of refugees from Syria and beyond. So what role does the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe have in all of this, and could it be doing more? Yvette McCullough reports.
The Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, focusing on security through geopolitical, economic and human dimensions. It traces its origins to the Cold War détente in the early 1970s. Then it was called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, mostly concerned with promoting dialogue between East and West. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it took on a new role, with a more permanent hands-on mandate and a new name. Today, the OSCE is made up of 57 countries across North America, Europe and Central Asia. Each has equal status, and decisions are made by consensus, but are non-binding. The OSCE deals with a wide range of security concerns, including arms control, conflict prevention and resolution, rule of law, good governance, and democratisation. It currently has missions in these countries, and a special monitoring mission operating in Ukraine. It gives daily updates on the ongoing conflict between pro-Russian rebels and Ukrainian forces in the east. It also had observers on the ground in the aftermath and investigation of Flight MH17, shot down over eastern Ukraine in July 2014. With tensions in Europe increasing, will the OSCE find itself once again a vital mediator between East and West? Or is a new approach needed to safeguarding Europe's security? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
I spoke to OSCE Secretary-General Lamberto Zanier at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul and asked him if the organization was facing a crisis of relevance.
I'm not sure it's a crisis of relevance. There's a crisis inside the organization because of geopolitics, because it's more difficult to engage in this environment. But at the same time, exactly because of geopolitics, we found a space that nobody else in Europe managed to find. That is the room created by the fact of being inclusive, by having everybody around the table. And so, regardless of the profile of the organization, we are very busy doing a number of things which I think at this time are useful.
You work quietly.
We work quietly. That's part of what we do. We tend to work to prevent conflicts, and the very notion of preventing conflicts requires quiet engagement.
So where have you been successful? What have you prevented?
That's a question I get sometimes, and it's obviously very difficult to answer, because if you're successful, nothing happens, and it's very difficult to say, well, that was me. But I'm convinced that investing in preventing conflict, investing in tools that are there to stabilize societies, to prevent crises, is a good investment, especially today.
Whenever I do a Russia-Ukraine interview or program, I rely quite heavily on what your monitors have reported on, particularly in the East and the Donbass. The impression we get, despite the criticisms that come from the monitors, the impression we get is that the Russians can do whatever they like, and that the Russian-backed rebels in the east of Ukraine have a free rein.
When you look at what's happening in the east, we ourselves have difficulties. We would like to have more freedom of movement in Donbass. We often find obstacles. Our monitors are stopped at checkpoints. We had instances where the monitors were even taken hostage. And even one of our Russian monitors was held hostage by the rebels. Which raises questions: who is, controlling what exactly there? And there are a number of issues that come up. There is an internal Ukrainian issue, but there is also a question of Russia feeling responsibility for Russians abroad, as they say, and as Minister Lavrov put it in one of our meetings, our compatriots abroad. And so there is a sense of support of Russia for the rebels, and there are these humanitarian convoys going in. We have evidence of weapons and ammunition turning up all the time, and regardless of the distraction created by the conflict, which is a very deadly conflict. We have victims almost every day.
But you give the impression that it's 50-50. There's like two sides to this story, and we're not taking sides. Russia swallowed up Crimea, right? That's illegal according to all international norms.
Yes, of course.
You criticize that. I mean, this is not parity, right? It's not 50-50, is it?
We did criticize it. The issue is that the conflict in and around Ukraine brought up the larger issues that are dividing Europe today. Yes, this is about Russia and Ukraine, and Crimea has been condemned, and we're trying to find ways ahead on Donbass. But if we look at what we call in the OSCE jargon the protracted conflicts, and whether it's Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, there is a larger problem. And the larger problem is the solidity of the Cold War outcomes, in a way. The relationship between Russia and the former Soviet space, but also, and more importantly, the relationship between Russia and the Euro-Atlantic institutions and the expansion of them. And perhaps the insufficient degree to which there has been a process of, how can I say, a consultation, trying to keep Russia on board while expanding these institutions.
Is Russia in an expansionist phase? When we see the buzzing of the jets in the Baltics, we see Russia's involvement in Syria, we see Russia's involvement in Ukraine. As the Euro-Atlantic institutions are expanding, is Russia in an expansionist and perhaps imperialist phase?
What we are seeing is that Russia now is investing a lot in promoting processes of integration around Russia, and including Central Asia, the Caucasus countries. And obviously we are in a process where we are setting up opposite blocks somehow, and potentially creating new divisions. And that's what we want to avoid.
New Cold War?
I wouldn't say it's a new Cold War for a number of reasons, and we are not at that stage, but on some parts of the agenda there is confrontation, and on some issues the language reminds us of the Cold War agenda. But then we have broader challenges, and dealing with terrorism, for example, where everybody converges. We adopted recently in Vienna a decision on cybersecurity.
Given that you guys work quietly and you try to prevent fires breaking out, the migrant crisis, is that a threat to European security, European integration?
Well, it may become if it's not managed properly. I think we need to look at the global agenda. We are seeing the beginning of a demographic crisis. We see the impact of climate change. Of course, conflict, and conflict is a primary source. But the role of organized crime, and we need to step up fighting against people traffickers. So there is a really broader agenda within which we need to put the migration crisis.
The Austrian far-right politician, representing a party that was founded by Nazis post-World War II, was an inch away from the presidency. Were you guys at the OSCE freaking out when you saw how close it was?
What is of concern is the reaction of the people to some of the security problems we have, and the radicalization within the societies. I think first of all we need to work within our societies to help people understand that world is changing. Societies are becoming more complex, more multicultural, and people have to adjust to that. They can't just react negatively, because this will create even more tensions. So we need policies where we manage the flows of migrants, and we manage the flows of people who will contribute to changing our policies. But we need also to look at integration policies, effective integration policies, including more accent on education, but also including preparing the public opinion. If we don't do that, then there will be fear, there will be radicalization, and there will be conflict within our societies.
Next month, the United Kingdom might cut itself off from Europe. Is that good or bad for you?
I think we need a stronger Europe in this moment. So if the UK leaves, this will weaken the European Union, and I think the UK has a strong role in also contributing to EU policies. And sometimes it sees itself as a victim of EU policies, or some in the UK see that. I think it would be important to turn this around and to make sure that the UK becomes a positive force within the EU, and from my perspective also within the OSCE. I would like to see also the UK more active in the OSCE on these issues.
Secretary General Lamberto Zanier, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Today's newsmaker was UN Special Envoy Gordon Brown, as we asked whether his new Global Education Fund would make a difference to the millions of children displaced by war and natural disasters. He told me children risk being drawn into extremism without proper schooling, and the world needed to do more to secure young refugees a future. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.